The forces that are working to preserve American democracy, and that includes all of us who are going to vote for that, should understand that there's no danger that we will be too aggressive, too bold, too strong in pressing the battle. Hi, I'm Andy Schmuckler, and I've been on a mission for a long time to help American democracy survive the force of fascism that's been rising in this country somewhat visibly for over 30 years. And I've been working on it full time since 2004, since I saw what it was that was coming to power. In that time, the side of democracy and the rule of law and pretty much everything decent in American values has been consistently too weak, too wimpy. And there's no danger that that anybody's going to that side is going to be excessively aggressive in pressing the battle now. People should just set that concern aside, and I've encountered it many times that people are afraid of fighting. Sometimes you got to fight. Earlier today, I talked here about the wimpiness that we've seen sometimes on the side of the good guys, like Obama not fighting the way he might have to protect that seat that was his rightfully by the Constitution to a point. And then Robert Mueller somehow being wimpy, way surprised me. I mean, hardly ever have I been so surprised by somebody after all I'd heard about this guy. He was so wimpy in going after Trump, who had committed, as he showed, but kind of failed to really bring out for the public to see that Trump had committed serious crimes. I used those examples last time, but there are lots of other examples. It is sort of in the DNA, you might say, of the good guy side in America in these times that liberal America has been somewhat blind and somewhat weak. And that between the two of them, that has empowered this force of fascism to rise to this extent. It's really uncertain whether, for example, a guy who committed the most serious crimes in American history right in front of our eyes might be able to avoid being held accountable by the rule of law, might be able to be reelected president and kill the cases that were belatedly brought and are being delayed by the Supreme Court. The fight against on the side of the rule of law, there is no limit to how aggressive the forces of fascism have been at every turn. And the reason we're in this condition right now is that on the one hand, the virus of fascism has taken over conservative America, while on the other hand, there's not been the kind of powerful response that's been called for since the early 90s to push that thing back. If you look in my, do a search for the word weakness on my YouTube channel, and you'll find me laying out a whole string of ways in which the good guy side has just been too wimpy. I also expressed my admiration for the kind of people like Jack Smith and Letitia James who have not been wimpy. So I think that the liberal side is probably almost congenitally incapable of pressing the battle too hard, being too strong in the words that need to be spoken. Don't worry about going too strong. Just ask what will have the maximal impact on moving the American people, making sure that this fascist force doesn't overturn American democracy in November or any time thereafter. I cannot imagine what an excessively aggressive posture would be that liberal America, the pro-democracy side, the rule of law side, would be capable of. I wonder on this. I wonder whether the prosecutors are being held back too much by some norms that maybe don't apply to this situation. I'm not sure that I'm right, but let me run this idea by you. I understand that I heard just last night when they're discussing this Supreme Court debacle that there's an asymmetry, that Trump is able to send his lawyers out and send himself out and talk about how he's being politically persecuted and all that. And on the other hand, they said the prosecutors don't do things that way. They speak only through their filings. Otherwise they maintain silence. I do understand the importance of the norms involved there with respect to the prosecutor, or at least I at least somewhat understand that importance. But I'm wondering, first of all, is there some legal requirement that they speak only that way? I'm not aware of it, but if there is not, then I would say, can't you make a distinction between prosecuting the case, which I imagine really should be kept by the prosecutor, largely to the filing documents, the indictments and stuff like that. But if what they were pointing out was an asymmetry between the defendant, who is free to spout off all kinds of garbage, which Trump regularly does, and the prosecutor, who has to stay mute. Well, I think that what's appropriate here, if it's legal, is for the prosecutors to deal with what's being said out of court by addressing it out of court. Why not? Why give an advantage to a defendant like no other, who is doing systematically warring against the rule of law, threatening, speaking to his following in such a way as to create great dangers to judges and prosecutors and witnesses, and because of a norm, the prosecutorial side that's representing the rule of law has to be silent? Well, I would think that that the publicly filed indictments, the speaking indictments, have various passages that somebody could come up and reply to what Trump says about this being a political prosecution. On the contrary, we've been compelled by this evidence, ... And when he says it's a political prosecution, one could stand up and say, no, not at all. Look at the way in which he has compelled us to go after him about these documents. He was given subpoenas. He vouched for this. He did that. We know that we have video of him hiding things from the rightful eyes of the law. Is there a reason why Trump can't be replied to? When you're up against someone like Trump in a battle in which the power of the defendant is of a magnitude that one is not accustomed to in the legal process. I mean, you don't usually worry about the balance of power between, say, the accused indicted criminal and the prosecutor. One of the prosecutors got the full weight of the government behind him. He's got the police, et cetera, et cetera. the FBI. But Donald Trump is different. He's got a following that if he says something, pretty soon there are hundreds of threats coming in to somebody's life who's representing the rule of law. I don't really know if there is a problem of excessive restraint on the part of the good guys still. I'm not sure exactly how it gets built in. Maybe it's just a failure to adapt to a new kind of situation. You're as a prosecutor, you're brought up in a system in which you've got all the power and you're not supposed to abuse it. But and you sometimes a new situation requires that you play play it differently. And maybe there's just not a flexibility in on the part of the culture in which people get brought up. You keep on playing the game that you were trained in. I had that experience in basketball. I played a certain kind of basketball in the polite circles of suburban St. Paul, Minnesota, in high school, and then it was difficult to adjust later playing sort of in a more city situation where the game was really a whole lot more physical. Took me a while to adjust. Okay, this is this form of basketball. That's what you got to play. Well, Donald Trump is throwing elbows quite a bit, and I like to. If Jack Smith can stand up and speak when Trump puts out stuff that really calls for refutation, I say, if it's just a norm restraining you, let's suspend that norm. Maybe draw the line in a different place. Maybe there's some ways you can talk and some that you got to wait until you're doing a legal function of filing or examining witnesses in court. But draw the line in such a way that the asymmetry enjoyed by the force of fascism and lawlessness is overcome. Because we've got a fight on our hands. The outcome is not crystal clear. I am optimistic, but I have observed in myself, I have a tendency to err in the direction of optimism. For example, I really didn't think that the Supreme Court were going to do this terrible thing about helping Trump delay the most important trial, probably past the election. I didn't see that. So I tend to, I have a pretty good track record about anticipating what's going to happen, but no human being has a really great record about that. Lots of surprises always in the world. And I just observe that when I'm wrong, I tend to be wrong in the direction of being overly optimistic. So I don't want to, rest on my optimistic sense that the majority of the American people are going to reject fascism. I think we got to beef up that probability and see if we can maximize its probability. And the only question that the good guy side should be asking in our various actions out into have an impact on America and how this outcome, this battle plays out, is what will have the biggest beneficial impact on the balance of strength between the forces of democracy and the rule of law and the forces of fascism and lawlessness embodied in Donald Trump and the rest of the fascistic side that we can see in this battle. What will have the maximal beneficial impact? Another place where I'm wondering if there's some kind of an ethic I'd like to see overcome. And it's got to do with, I was observing last night, said in the previous video, people I really, really, really respect and always am glad to listen to. Andrew Weissman, Neil Katyal, and then Lawrence Tribe, who the first guy, Weissman, was sort of the most prominent and widely feared prosecutor in the Mueller team. Neil Katyal was an acting Solicitor General in the Obama White House. And Laurence Tribe is a sort of a giant of American constitutional scholarship. He's been teaching constitutional law at Harvard Law School for more than half a century, and among his students are some of the most prominent public figures like Adam Schiff and I forget who some of the others, and he's in his late 80s, I think, or mid 80s, and he's still very sharp. And he was very much talked about as a possible Supreme Court justice when Clinton was in the position to be replacing a couple people. But he chose other people like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and that was fine. Anyway, Laurence Tribe is regularly on TV. Those three guys, I inferred from what they talked about and from what they didn't talk about was that there's some kind of norm that's getting in the way of their speaking about the court the way I think it's time to have people like that speaking about this court. I talked in the previous video about this is the worst, most corrupt court in American history, the most partisan court. And they're partisan not just for any old political faction, but from a plutocratic, fascistic one that deals all the time in lies, that manipulates its people, that is continually acting in ways that make the world worse. It's a very ugly political force, and they are its agents. I think that needs to be said, and I don't think it's too soon to start stressing it. But these guys they were talking about their concerns about the effects of what the Supreme Court had done. And that was all very valid. Their concern has got to do with delay and with Laurence's Tribes, he focused a lot on why did they frame the question that this case is going to be about in that way? It's just asking for confusion when it's really quite clear. All we got to do is ask the question, does a president of the United States have immunity from criminal prosecution if he attempts to overturn the results of an election in which he's a candidate? That was the only question, he said. He questioned the rightness of the decision, but he didn't, and Neil Katyal didn't, Andrew Weissman didn't talk about why would the Supreme Court do this? I mean, it is so obvious what the public interest is. It is so obvious. It's at least, it's more obvious in a way than in the case of Nixon versus the United States about whether he had to turn over the tapes. They did that in a hurry. They resolved it. The public interest was such that they made sure that it moved forward quickly and decisively. Obviously, what the Supreme Court should have done here. Why didn't they? The Supreme Court has shown that it can act that way. In that case, I believe that the special counsel asked the Supreme Court to intervene with Nixon, skipping the step of the Court of Appeals, because the urgency was so important. And the Supreme Court agreed to do that. They took the case directly, it leapfrogged over the Court of Appeals. The Supreme Court heard the issue, resolved it, Nixon obeyed, that was that. Pretty soon Nixon was out of office. Why was this court different from that court? They need to have the trials, legitimate trials of the most serious nature, based on indictments brought by average American citizens to put the matter out in front of the public in a public trial, and to have a jury of his peers pass judgment, and also convey to the American people who are going to have to choose a president whether this guy is or is not guilty of these most serious crimes. I mean, it was back in the Nixon days, there was a lot of energy. We really did want to get this Watergate thing with Nixon's crimes moving forward as Congress was moving toward impeachment. But I don't think there was nearly the urgency there is in this case. I mean, with Nixon, he was doing his job, reasonably. Years. I mean, he was at least, even if he was guilty of crimes, that didn't mean that he couldn't be trusted to, basically operate the American presidency in the national interest. Here's a guy that's running for president and talking about how he's going to weaponize the legal system and openly showing his preference for the fascist aggressor from Moscow over the legitimate needs of the Ukrainian democracy and the determined national interests that the Americans have agreed on since Russia became so aggressive toward Ukraine. The American people really should know. So why didn't Weissman and Katyal and Lawrence Tribe say something about what this shows? I mean, the effects are very important. The delay that they are giving Trump, it's important. But what it shows about the court that they did that is also important. I don't want what is the norm that leads these people who see these things? I mean, I'm not thinking that they don't understand what they see, but they're not talking about it. I'd like to hear them talk about it. I'd like as many people as possible to be thinking about, we got a problem here with this court. It's not just corrupt on a given kind of issue, like the Dred Scott decision was a slave owners' court in 1857, and the corporate world had huge domination over the Supreme Court from the 1870s to the New Deal, when there was that big confrontation between FDR, who wanted to protect workers and the public, and the Supreme Court that was basically an extension of the corporate power. But today's court is really, I think, unique in our history in the extent to which it is across the board partisan. It's a different thing than being pro-slave power or being pro-corporate interest, to be not only pro both of those things in their current manifestations, but also ruling for the gun the NRA types in a way that's quite corrupt, ruling for the plutocracy like in Citizens United in a way that's quite corrupt, helping the Republican Party disenfranchise black people with gutting the part of the Voting Rights Act. I mean, across the board, and maybe about to do something big for corporate America by eliminating much of the power of the federal government to regulate these economic giant powers in the public interest. Across the board. And abortion. handed down in a very fascistic, theocratic spirit. We really do need to look at this problem, which is going to go on for a generation beyond, if we don't do anything about it. So I think that if there are only norms holding people back from speaking out, like Jack Smith responding to Trump, and like these guys on the television saying to the American people, this is what we're seeing about what the Supreme Court has become. And we have a Supreme Court problem. We need them to be telling us those things, not just the niceties and legalities that Andrew Weissman is so brilliant at exposing. But you can tell he's got that moral passion. He believes in the rule of law. Well, I'd like to have that passion knock over some of the barriers about what he's saying. And it's not just there. Of course, it's not just there. And we're talking about the battle between democracy and fascism, which is, at this point, it's joined on the presidential race. It's presumably going to be the rematch between Biden and Trump. That is democracy versus fascism. But it is joined everywhere in our political realm. It reminds me a little bit of the 1850s. What's remarkable about that is really the most remarkable decade in American history, before these times anyway. If you read The Impending Crisis by Potter and so, you can just see this amazing thing that everything in American politics was basically about the issue of slavery, whether the slave power would be allowed to expand or whether it wouldn't. And whether it would be able to protect itself in this way or that way, like with the fugitive slave law, everything had to do with the issue of slavery. What was I just going to say? Oh, yeah, the Transcontinental Railroad. I mean, that was the one that left an enduring impression on my mind, the extent to which everything had to do with slavery. The United States was ready to embark upon what's still considered historically a major thing, a transcontinental railroad from the Atlantic to the Pacific. I mean, there are movies about this thing. They couldn't get started. And the reason they couldn't get started is that there were these different routes. And these different routes had different implications over the battle over slavery. I won't go any further into it than that. But we live in a time that's sort of like that. Only it's not the slave power that we're up against, though there is an enormous amount of overlap. I wrote a piece called "The Power That Drove Us to Civil War Is Back." That was 2014. I wrote that. It's not quite as the facial recognition technology doesn't find the present one quite the same degree of resemblance, but there's a lot of it there. But Trump has brought in a freshly fascistic kind of spirit that wasn't there in 2014. But everything in our politics right now seems to hinge on this battle. Whether even passing a budget brings us up against the Matt Gaetzes and the Marjorie Taylor Greene and the craziness and the fascism and the determination that all of politics is about engaging in war, and none of the politics is about finding ways of cooperating with others. Even with opponents, to get good things done. This is an ugly thing. We need to make as many people as possible to see that ugliness. Every point that we are engaged in, whether it's got to do with passing the Ukrainian fund, which is the Republicans are basically driving America into defeat in terms of what all the presidents up until Trump we're determined to defend. Our national interest is not with for Putin to succeed, but for him to fail. That's democracy versus fascism. Every place we look, it's really a recognizable pattern. This needs to be trumpeted out into the society. The American people need to be, hit on the head with a 2x4 or whatever will have the maximal impact. We've had a lot of wimpiness on the side of the good guys, going back to the early 90s and even going back before that, enabling the right wing, for example, to create this court. There were more fights to be fought. And it wasn't just Obama that didn't fight all the fight that could be fought. Back in 2014, if you go to my website, abetterhumanstory.org, you'll find something called Press the Battle. That has been the shortcoming on the good guys' side forever. You can see it in the way John Kerry was helpless when the Swift boaters came after him. Look at that. The liberal side is not inherently wimpy. My hero among presidents, really, is FDR. I mean, I love Lincoln. I'm not as passionate about George Washington, but I guess he's in the top three. And I admire some important ways in which he conducted himself, like leaving office after 2 terms. But FDR shows that a fighter can be the voice of the good guys. He stood, when he gave a speech at some point, I think in running for a second term, I think it was, a speech in Cleveland, the I See in America speech. He delivered a vision of what kind of country he envisioned we could become. And it was a beautiful vision. It was a very liberal vision. It was a vision of human possibilities. When I was a candidate for Congress, I used that speech to highlight what we good guys represent in the political battlefield. This is what FDR was fighting for. And it was a beautiful way of fighting that he brought to it. He articulated a vision, and he said to the forces of plutocracy of that day that were opposed to him, I welcome their hatred. And he went after them. He stood toe to toe with them. When do we see the liberals of America going toe to toe with the even more fascistic force that's arrayed against us now? I think that Jack Smith and Letitia James in their filings have been quite eloquent. They've made their arguments. But the American public needs to hear a lot more than they hear when somebody files a brilliant bill of indictments. Nerds like me will follow it. And I'm saying, yeah, we know. But most people, it's sort of upsetting the extent to which a lot of people don't see a lot of things. But they can be helped to see them. One specific thing that I want to bring up about how everybody on the good guy side really has to just say, what's the most impactful thing? And not be afraid of being too bold. Just make sure, just craft it in whatever way is going to have the biggest beneficial impact on how this battle goes. One very specific thing is that I believe that one of the things that should be trumpeted is we know he's guilty. You know, people tiptoe around that. Oh, he has a right to a fair trial. Yes, he does. Then there's the fallacy that goes along with that that I've encountered in my encounters in the public realm. Oh, you have we have to. Trump deserves to be presumed innocent. I've had a non-Trumpy Republican chastise me for writing about how we know he's guilty, or writing, as if I just simply assert that he's guilty. And I've been told, oh no, he has a right to be presumed innocent. There is a reply to that. I'm going to conclude this video with how that should be countered, because we really should tell the whole country, especially when the Supreme Court's going to try to make sure that nobody really gets exposed to the truth. And we who have been following mountains of available evidence know that he's guilty. So what about that presumption of innocence thing that's part of the American rule of law? Oh, that has a particular meaning. It doesn't apply to us as citizens. What it applies to is the juror. The jury has the duty. They swear that they will hear the case in court and make a judgment based on the facts that get established and the law. That's their duty. They are supposed to require the prosecutor to prove beyond a reasonable doubt the guilt of the guilty as charged. I like that. I support that. Yeah, the defendant does have a right to a fair trial. We are not jurors. We are citizens. Our job is to take the available evidence and draw the necessary conclusions. And there's way more than enough evidence for us to know he is guilty of as charged in all these respects. We know enough to know that he committed the things that will be tried in Chutkan's court. I know it. I know it better than I know almost anything else in our public life. We know that that the story of what happened with those documents proves that he is guilty of several important felonies that endanger national security. Defying subpoenas, stealing documents that are not his, endangering national security by his handling of them, lying to the federal authorities about his compliance. I mean, there it is. We know he's guilty. I would say, if I were in a jury pool and I was pulled up, I know that because for all kinds of reasons, I would not be allowed to serve on the jury. But I feel that I could promise and keep the promise that I would give him the benefit of the presumption of innocence, meaning I would require that the charges be proved beyond a reasonable doubt by the prosecutor. I have no real doubt that Jack Smith's team is going to do that. But if he didn't, I would vote to acquit because I would keep my promise. I mean, everything that I think that I know that's true, I could be an honest juror requiring it to be proved. I mean, even though every basic scientific principles that I think I know are valid, I could require it to be proved in some kind of agreed upon clean process like we've created. It's one of the marvels of our culture that we have taken the whole thing of justice and created a structure where evidence is presented in court and there's cross-examination and there's a jury of one's peers, and that is our best attempt to see that justice gets done. I love it. But we citizens have no reason not to presume innocence when we know that he's guilty, and we have the duty to make that judgment. It's not a judgment, by the way, like those jurors about whether or not this guy might be sent to jail. That's what the Bill of Rights is supposed to be protecting. It's got to do with people's liberty and property not being taken from them by the state, but through a whole process which is intended to assure justice. Yeah, let's do that there. But here we're talking about giving power to a traitor, to a criminal, to a guy who's telling us right out loud and right out front he's going to destroy American democracy. So part of what we need to convey to the American people, and this is an antidote to the terrible thing that the Supreme Court just did, is that we know he's guilty and we can tell the American people, here's why we know he's guilty. Even if he manages to delay his trial so that we can't have it until everybody got to vote. Everybody who goes to vote should recognize it is crystal clear this man committed some of the most serious crimes in American history. No such thing as being too strong in pressing this battle. Thank you. Come back, please. I'll be around.